G'day folks, welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update for the nation today, the 26th of January 2015. Hope you've had a wonderful Australia Day long weekend and getting ready to get back into the grind. Unfortunately for teachers and students and schools, all going back tomorrow. I'm glad those full-time teaching days are over. I used to dread the night before the start of the school year. Alright folks, this update is sponsored by Campbell Scientific Australia, when measurements matter. Not too much happening across the northern half of the continent today. We've got some good showers and storms developing around the southeast corner of Queensland and also into northeast New South Wales. Some isolated showers and storms further up the coast along the northeast Queensland coast. Some of those are quite strong storms, but very isolated. Also around the southeastern Gulf country and the western peninsula, we're seeing some really good storm activity due to the northwesterly flow that's streaming into that area and a trough system that's lying through the north there. Across the far northern top end coast, we've got some good shower and storm activity. Again, very dry underneath that though, so the actual shower and storm activity is quite limited to coastal zones. Also in the North Kimberley and getting in towards the Western Kimberley now, we're starting to see a trough system which is creating some fairly heavy thunderstorm activity. Now that is set to increase in WA. Alrighty, this afternoon on the synoptic chart we can see here the trough system lying through Queensland, extending north into the territory. Unfortunately, there is too much dry mid-level air a little further to the north above this trough line to create any meaningful shower and storm activity, so it is really located on that coastal fringe in the Northern Territory coastline. Across the western parts, we're seeing a trough building here, and this trough will get stronger and stronger as over the next couple of days, and we should see stronger storm activity and more widespread storm activity over the next couple of days across northern WA. Across Queensland, we'll see a bit of a dry change pushing northwards, but this trough system lingering in through here is going to create continuation of showers and storms across the southern half of the state and into the central parts of the state, with activity becoming more isolated further to the north and then redeveloping fairly extensively across the northern parts of the peninsula. Now what's interesting is further out to the east, along this trough line, we're expecting to see a bit of an elongated low pressure system develop and then push eastwards towards Vanuatu. Now in this area here, the low may intensify over the next week to 10 days, and then there is some guidance pushing it back here towards the west, towards Queensland, and there's also some guidance that pushes it south and then southeast out here in the South Pacific. That will be quite interesting to see which option it adopts, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of this broadcast. Before we do that, let's take a look at rainfall over the next few days, and then we'll come back to this. Okay, on to rainfall tomorrow. You can see that trough system across the southern parts of Queensland is going to create extensive shower and storm activity. Some of that activity could become severe with a little bit of upper level support there as well. Now that activity should move northwards to around about at this stage, looking at the northern extent being around Bowen to Mackay, and then kicking back off around the Atherton Tablelands with a clearance in the middle there between Cairns and around that Bowen to Mackay zone. So folks, in between that, not looking at too much, maybe the odd isolated shower or storm not being picked up here, but overall this is where the activity will lie tomorrow and up here to the north in the North Peninsula. Across the top end, we see a little bit more rainfall developing further to the south as we get some northerly winds pushing back to the south. So we've had a fairly dry change over the last couple of days pushing through, and now we've got a little bit of moisture coming back into the area. Now, as we get further to the west here to the WA region, we can see extensive shower and storm activity expected tomorrow across the eastern interior, the North Kimberley, and also pushing into the East Pilbara and also the eastern Gascoyne as well. On Wednesday, it seems to be a bit of a carbon copy here for Queensland. Continuation of extensive shower and storm activity across the southern half, and once again, anywhere north of about Bowen, the isolated shower and storm activity is very, very isolated. And so we don't see that kick back in until you get north of about Cooktown, and then further to the north towards the Torres Strait. You can see a general increase in shower and storm activity here on the eastern Coral Sea, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Over to the west, we'll see a little bit of a clearance here back to isolated showers and storms across the northwestern regions of the territory, as most of the storm activity becomes focused along that trough line in the eastern WA region and northern WA region. As we get to Thursday, if we look at Queensland again, we'll start this way. So on Thursday, we'll see a continuation of isolated showers and storms getting more scattered now closer to the coast. in the southern and Capricornia regions, as well as that isolated activity further to the north. Remember, the storms that will be north of about Mackay will be much more isolated than the storms that are south of there. Across the Torres Strait, we continue to see a fairly active northwesterly flow creating extensive shower and storm activity. Across the top end, we've got some fairly dry weather creeping in, particularly over the eastern, northeastern parts of the top end, so we could even see areas that are completely fine there, as opposed to the isolated showers and storms we would come to expect. As we get into WA, we'll continue to see an active trough system here creating extensive shower and storm activity across the Kimberley. A little bit less across the far eastern interior of the state as that trough system just drifts a little further to the west. That means areas around Port Hedland could be in with just the chance of picking up a rogue shower or storm that develops outside of this region. But in general, we're going to see a lot of thunderstorm activity over WA over the next couple of days. As we get into Friday, the end of our week, this week, we might see a little bit more activity around the central coast and Whitsundays and the Herbert and Lower Burdekin in terms of isolated showers and storms. Bit of a weakening or an easing of activity across the peninsula here, and really only the Torres Strait now being affected by those northwesterlies. Darwin and the rest of the top end fairly dry for this time of year, certainly dry for this time of year in fact, and we'll continue to see very active conditions, and you'll start to see actually some of these more extensive and more stronger storms and more rainfall in these storms drifting further to the south now into the far eastern Gascoyne region, getting into even the goldfields further to the south of WA. And really, folks, that's where most of the activity will be centered and focused on is WA in the 4 to 8 day period as well. So there could be parts of the parched Pilbara coastline that could receive some showers and storms over the next week. And that's great news for them. They have missed out pretty well on the entire wet season's rainfall. Across Queensland, things are going to get fairly dry this weekend, unless you live maybe in the northern parts of the state where we could see a continuation of some shower and storm activity, particularly on the peninsula, getting down into the northern goldfields and upper Flinders district as well. Across the top end, we'll continue to see fairly dry conditions for this time of year as well. Look, falls of 25 to 50 millimetres are possible, but really that would be expected over 1 or 2 days rather than over the 4 to 8 day period. For the entire week, folks, we are looking at the next 4 days obviously being very active down here in the southern parts of Queensland, but really very dry for this time of year through most of northern Australia, except for WA. We see very, very active trough system here with a lot of moisture pushing into it. Alrighty, let's fast forward to 5 days' time. Now, the Access G model from the Bureau of Meteorology, thanks to Weather Zone here for the graphics, you can see is predicting a low pressure system developing in the northeastern Coral Sea. Now, it's interesting to see that that low doesn't do too much here throughout the week, and then it's only until Monday, Tuesday next week where it actually intensifies to a cyclone, and then you can see a big ridge underneath it. Now, that ridge is going to push it westwards, no doubt about that. It's just a matter of how long that ridge can stay there. Now, it's also a case of the model could be getting confused by 2 low pressure systems. The first one here, the second one just off your screen here, just to the east here of Vanuatu, and also the byplay or the the interaction between these two along a trough line could result in a completely different movement to what's being modelled here. I mean, if one of them only forms, then it's pretty easy. We can speculate that it will push to the west, but if 2 of them form, things could get quite complex out here in the Coral Sea. So, looking further on in the Access G model out to day 10, you can see the system is slowly drifting to the west under the influence of a very strong high pressure system here at the surface to mid-levels. Remembering, of course, that the stronger a cyclone gets, the less it's governed by what's happening near the surface of the Earth, and the more it's governed by what's happening above the surface of the Earth. And so to do that, if we take a look at the 300 hectopascal flow, we can actually see quite a dilemma here that the cyclone is having between a flow that's trying to drag it here in a south to southeasterly direction and a surface flow that's trying to drag it more in a west-southwesterly direction. So it's in the horrors here as to which way it's going to go, because it's being governed by 2 quite separate steering flows at 2 different levels of the atmosphere. The GFS forecast model, thanks to Weather Zone as well, out to day 8, we can see that the low is a much weaker system on the GFS model, way out here to the far northeastern Coral Sea, actually further than the northeastern Coral Sea. It's in the southwest Pacific here, between the Solomon Islands and Fiji. And as we track it into the future here, we can see that the system is starting to drift to the west, but it can't get far enough to the west to affect Queensland. It only gets far enough to the west to affect New Caledonia. But look, it is on the GFS forecast model, it is a significant Category 4 or 5 tropical cyclone. So it is something that we will need to watch for our friends in the Southwest Pacific, should it adopt this sort of track and at this sort of location. So we'll know a little bit more about that as we get a little closer into the time. So you can see here we're looking 9th of February. So a lot's going to change between now and then, and a few of these models are going to be completely off. One of them is probably going to be quite accurate. And the Canadian CMC also on board with a tropical low or tropical cyclone developing in the far eastern Coral Sea. And in the Canadian, at that particular point in time, we would have a steering flow that would be pushing the cyclone to the southeast away from Queensland. However, should the cyclone take a little longer to develop, the ridge will push across and will be the governing factor in at least the weak stages of the system tracking back towards the west. If we take a look at the long range in the European ensemble, and we can see a fairly similar issue here, that the European ensemble quite difficult to track or place where the system's going to be in 10 days time. So obviously that blue circle just here, not the one that I just drew, but the blue circle here is likely to be the most likely location. However, we have a fairly wide degree of variability as to where the system's going to lie. The big thing to note is that the Euro is quite on board with the high pressure ridge building in at the surface to the south of the low or the cyclone. So with that sort of building of a ridge in behind it, in underneath it, it's going to limit the potential for the system to track southeast. So if the ridge can build in time, the system will not move southeast, it'll move back towards the west. The other problem that would happen should a ridge build in underneath it at that location is an entrainment of dry air, and also an increase in possible vertical wind shear between the surface and the upper levels. Remember how I said the system would be in the horrors between the surface trying to push it out here towards the west and the upper levels, which is going to be trying to push it out here towards the south-southeast, and that combining those two factors would result in a weakening of the system as it tracks to the west. However, still a long time away, and we still don't know how the upper level flow is going to unfold yet. We're pretty confident here on the surface level flow, at least out to days 8 and 9. The computer models are very much on board with this high pressure ridge building in around about day 8 or day 9, which is early in February. And after that, though, what the upper level flow does, the computer models are not very good at picking that at this early point in time. So we'll need to sit tight and watch this over the next few days and see how it all unfolds. The other areas of interest here, the Gulf of Carpentaria, the computer models are predicting a couple of them, predicting a little bit of a weak low there, and also the Timor Sea could be an area to watch. There is an area also way out here to the west of WA, but look, even if that does start coming towards the coast, it's going to be thousands of kilometres to the west. So there's no real threat here for WA from the system that could develop out on the border of our area of responsibility. We'll have a lot more to talk about on that tropical low for the Queensland subscribers tomorrow in your subscriber update. Thanks for watching this update, folks, and we'll talk again on Thursday night at around about 9 PM Queensland time will be our next update. So we'll talk then. From us here at OCC, have a great week.